The forward evacuation base in the volcanic region smelled like the inside of a furnace, scorched rock, sulfur, and the weight of ash that clung to everything like a second skin. Rebecca Ray Martinez stood at the edge of the operations tent, watching the daily ritual unfold. The morning briefing was in full swing, digital boards rotating through evacuation zone overlays and supply drop manifests. Green lights blinked beside assigned flight crews, red lights marked empty slots, and her name appeared nowhere on either list. Julian Harrow commanded the tent like he owned it, his voice smooth and public-facing as he gestured toward corridor routes and thermal blooms. "We'll need a load-ready bird by 0700, he announced, his flight vest looking more tailored than issued. "If visibility doesn't improve by 0800, we delay the entire canyon wing. I want no debris ingestion on ascent. Clear?" Ray had been stationed at this god-forsaken base for 8 months, watching the same scene play out every morning. She was technically a pilot, certified, experienced, combat-tested, but according to the current rotation schedule, she might as well have been invisible. Her shirt bore no rank insignia, no unit patch, only a sun-bleached tag that read, "Support." The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd flown recon insertions during mudslide evacuations 3 years earlier, navigating terrain that would make most pilots wet themselves. But politics had a way of grounding good pilots while promoting the connected ones. Julian's uncle was a general. Ray's father had been a mechanic. When she stepped forward half a pace and spoke, "The Draco's airframe can handle the ridge turn. Even under partial uplift if we follow the east edge." Julian's response was swift and surgical. "Support crew, please hold comments until maintenance checkouts are complete. We're prioritizing active platforms." The chuckles that followed hit. "Harder than any direct insult," someone muttered. "Still thinks she's rated." Another voice added, "What'll she fly with? Fairy dust?" Ray stepped back to her position by the tent wall, the flight log still pressed against her side. She'd been here before, and she'd be here. Tomorrow, the U-28A Draco sat at the bottom of the standby list. Status: inactive. Command called it soft duty now, no longer prestigious enough for headlines or commendations, but Ray knew something they didn't. She'd been studying the ash patterns, mapping thermal windows, and calculating flight paths they'd never think to consider. While they dismissed her as dead weight, she was preparing for the moment when their arrogance would cost lives, and only she could save them. The Draco waited at the end of the flight line, its matte finish speckled with fine ash. To most it looked like a forgotten relic. To Ray it looked like a sleeping dragon, coiled and ready. She rested her hand briefly on the engine intake, feeling the warm metal pulse beneath her palm. Behind her, laughter carried from the tent. The rhythm of preparation continued. Checklist calls, repositioned gear, the buzz of planning that excluded her completely. But Ray had learned patience the hard way. She'd been underestimated before, dismissed as support crew, told to wait. Her turn. What they didn't know was that her turn was coming, and when it did, she'd be ready. The morning briefings became a daily exercise in humiliation, though Ray doubted Julian saw it that way. To him, she was probably just background noise, a former pilot who'd been relegated to support duties and hadn't gotten the message yet. But to Ray, each dismissal felt like a calculated insult, each ignored suggestion a reminder that her expertise meant nothing without the right connections. "Martinez!" Julian called out during the 3rd week of September, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for inconvenient interruptions. "I need you to run diagnostics on the auxiliary fuel pumps. The real pilots need to focus on mission, planning." The tent fell silent except for the hum of cooling fans and the distant sound of aircraft engines. Ray looked up from the weather data she'd been analyzing, data that showed a significant shift in thermal patterns that could affect their afternoon runs. "Sir, the pressure gradient readings indicate diagnostics Martinez fuel pumps now." A few pilots exchanged glances. Captain David Chen, one of the younger officers who still had some decency left, looked uncomfortable. He'd flown with Ray years ago before the reassignment that had stripped her of active duty status. He knew what she was capable of, but speaking up would mean questioning Julian's authority in front of the entire team. Ray folded her weather analysis and stood. "Yes, sir." As she walked toward the maintenance bay, she heard Julian's voice resume its confident cadence. Now, as I was saying about the northern approach vectors, the briefing continued as if she'd never existed. The fuel pump diagnostics took 20 minutes. The pumps were fine. They'd been fine yesterday, and they'd be fine tomorrow. This was busy work, designed to keep her occupied while the real pilots handled the important stuff. But as she worked, Ray noticed something interesting. The maintenance logs showed irregularities in fuel consumption rates for the C-145s, patterns that suggested the pilots were avoiding certain flight paths. She pulled up the route data and cross-referenced it with her thermal analysis. The picture became clear they were taking longer, less efficient routes to avoid ash columns that were actually navigable with proper timing and technique. They were burning extra fuel and wasting time because they didn't understand the wind patterns she'd been studying for months. That afternoon, 2 missions were delayed due to fuel shortages. Julian blamed logistics, then weather, then equipment. Failures. He never once acknowledged that his pilot's route choices might be the problem. Ray kept her observations to herself, but she made detailed notes in her personal log. Captain Chen found her later that evening, sitting by the generator trailer with her charts spread across a makeshift table. "You know, Martinez," he said quietly, settling down beside her. "Some of us remember when you were the best canyon pilot in the squadron." Ray looked up from her calculations. "That was a long time ago, David." "Not that long, and flying doesn't change. You either have it or you don't." He glanced at her charts, recognizing the precision of her work. "Harrow's got connections, but he doesn't have instincts. Everyone knows it." "Everyone except the people who matter." David was quiet for a moment, then leaned closer. "The Draco's still certified for operations. I checked the database yesterday. Someone's been maintaining its flight status even though it's not on the active roster." Ray's pencil stopped moving. "Someone?" "You, I'm guessing. You've been keeping it mission ready." He stood, brushing ash from his pants. "Just thought you should know that if something happened, if we needed every available aircraft, the Draco would be legal to fly. And you'd still be legal to fly it." After he left, Ray sat in the growing darkness, staring at her charts. The thermal patterns revealed a narrow window of opportunity, a flight path through the ash columns that could cut mission times in half. But sharing this information would mean another public dismissal, another reminder that her expertise was unwelcome. Instead, she folded her charts and walked to the Draco. The aircraft sat silent in the moonlight, its canopy reflecting the stars. She climbed into the cockpit and ran through emergency procedures by memory, her hands finding every switch and control by instinct. She'd been patient long enough. If Julian wanted to keep her grounded, fine. But she'd be ready when the time came. And something told her that time was coming sooner than anyone expected. The rumors started small, whispered conversations that stopped when Ray entered a room. Julian had been making inquiries, they said. Questions about her previous assignments, her flight certifications, her attitude problems. Word was he wanted her transferred to another base, somewhere she couldn't be a constant reminder of his limitations. Ray learned about the transfer. Request from Captain Chen, who'd overheard Julian talking to the base commander. "He's saying you're a distraction," Chen told her during a quiet moment behind the supply depot. "Claims you're undermining mission readiness by questioning established procedures." "I haven't questioned anything publicly," Ray replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Her suggestions during briefings, her attempts to share her thermal analysis, her very presence in the operations tent, all of it challenged Julian's authority simply by existing. "Doesn't matter. He's building a case. Says you refuse to accept your support role, that you're living in the past." Chen's voice carried a warning. "Martinez, he's got the base commander's ear. If he pushes for this transfer, it'll go through." The irony was sharp. Ray had spent months quietly doing her job, maintaining the Draco, running diagnostics, keeping her head down. But her competence itself had become a threat. Julian couldn't have someone around who highlighted his inadequacies by contrast. That afternoon, during the briefing, Julian made his move more directly. "I've been reviewing our support staff assignments," he announced, his eyes finding Ray with predatory precision. "Some personnel seem to have difficulty adapting to their current roles. Perhaps it's time we considered reassignments that better match individual capabilities. The message was clear. Fall in line or face the consequences. Ray felt every eye in the tent on her, waiting for her response. She could object, defend herself, make her case. But that would only prove Julian's point about her being difficult to manage. Instead, she said nothing. Silence was sometimes the most powerful response, but that evening she made a decision. If Julian wanted to play politics, she'd give him something to really worry about. She began compiling a comprehensive report on fuel inefficiencies caused by suboptimal routing, complete with data on delayed missions, wasted resources, and missed opportunities. She documented every instance where her expertise had been dismissed, every time a mission had suffered because pride had trumped competence. The report was 15 pages long and devastating in its precision. Ray didn't plan to submit it through official channels. Julian would bury it before it reached anyone who mattered. But she knew Captain Chen had contacts at the regional command level, people who understood the difference between leadership and showmanship. Meanwhile, she continued her nightly vigils with the Draco. The aircraft had become more than just a machine to her. It was a promise she'd made to herself, a reminder that her skills hadn't atrophied despite months of forced inactivity. She'd memorized every gauge, every control surface response, every quirk of its aging systems. When the moment came, and Ray was certain it would come, she'd be ready. The transfer orders arrived 3 days later. Ray was to report to a logistics depot in Nevada within 2 weeks, effective immediately upon completion of current duties. It was a career-ending assignment, the kind of posting that signaled the end of any hope for advancement or meaningful contribution. Julian delivered the news personally, his satisfaction barely concealed. Sometimes a change of scenery is exactly what someone needs, he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. I'm sure you'll find your new assignment enlightening. Ray accepted the orders without comment, but inside she felt something shift. The patient, professional facade she'd maintained for months began to crack. Julian had just made a critical error. He'd given her nothing left to lose. That night, she sent her efficiency report to Captain Chen with a simple note, "When the time is right." Then she walked to the Draco one last time as its assigned pilot. The aircraft seemed to sense the change in her, responding to her touch, with an eagerness that had been dormant too long. 2 weeks. Ray had 2 weeks to prove that Julian's golden boy image was nothing but polish over incompetence. 2 weeks to show that dismissing expertise in favor of politics was a dangerous game. She didn't have to wait long. The emergency alert hit at 1600 hours on a Tuesday, its sharp tone cutting through the afternoon heat like a blade. Ray was cleaning hydraulic filters when the radio crackled to life with a message that changed everything. Geological Field Team. Trapped South Canyon breach, lava flow accelerating, no vertical egress, helo abort confirmed. The operations tent erupted into controlled chaos. Julian's voice rose above the din, barking orders and demanding status reports. But Ray could hear the undercurrent of panic in his tone. This was the kind of situation that separated real leaders from pretenders. "Who was flying that rotation?" someone shouted. "Visibility tanked, rotor wash picked up a full thermal column," came the reply. "Helo had to abort." Ray dropped her tools and moved toward the tent, her mind already racing through the possibilities. She'd studied the South Canyon for months, mapping its thermal patterns and wind currents. If anyone could navigate that death trap, it was her. But she also knew that Julian would never. "Get me a fixed wing that can descend," Julian ordered, his composure cracking slightly. "Anything with drop capacity." "Nothing slotted for that terrain," the operations officer replied. "C-145's too fast, C-208's stalled in pre-flight. What else is available?" "Nothing certified, not for Ash Zone re-entry." Ray stepped into the tent, already wearing her flight gear. The laminated route chart was folded in her sleeve, creased from months of study and preparation. She didn't. "Speak immediately!" She waited for the room to notice her presence, for the desperate conversation to pause. When it did, she unfolded her chart in one smooth motion and laid it flat on the operations table. The silence that followed was deafening. "I can take the Draco," she said quietly. The response was immediate and predictable. "That thing's not cleared," someone scoffed. "You're not cleared," another added. "You haven't flown in this quadrant. In 6 months." Ray didn't blink. She pointed to her hand-drawn chart, its precise annotations and calculated vectors. "This pattern opens in 14 minutes. Visibility stabilizes through the plume. Updraft pulse carries for 12. I can reach the shelf, drop, extract, and climb out before the seal recloses." A logistics captain leaned in, his voice skeptical, but not cruel. "You drew that with a pencil." "I drew it with time," Ray replied. Julian stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and desperation. This was his worst nightmare, being shown up by the pilot he'd tried to silence, in front of the entire command staff during a crisis that demanded real competence over political connections. "Draco's a recon ship," he argued. "No hard shielding, no evac locks." "She's light enough to balance with terrain drift," Ray countered. "I've flown that exact airframe in tighter bands under worse visibility." The base commander studied her chart, his finger tracing the route markers and elevation cues. The room held its collective breath. Outside, precious minutes were ticking away, and the trapped team was running out of time. "You're not on the board," the commander said finally. "I know. You're not certified under current rotation. I know that too." The silence stretched until a quiet voice from the back of the tent broke it. "Let her go." It was Captain Chen, his words carrying the weight of professional judgment over personal politics. The commander looked at him, then back at Ray's chart, then at Julian's stricken face. "File your departure verbally," the commander said finally. "If you clear the ridge, you own the mission." Ray's response was immediate and confident. "I already do." As she turned to leave, Julian grabbed her arm. "This is career suicide, Martinez. If you crash that bird, if you fail—" Ray looked down at his hand on her arm, then back at his face. Her voice was steady, carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd found their moment. "Julian, I've been career dead for months. You made sure of that, but those people in the canyon, they're not dead yet. And I'm not going to let them die because you were too proud to admit you need me." She walked out of the tent without looking back, leaving Julian standing among the officers and staff who had just witnessed the collapse of his carefully constructed authority. The Golden Boy had been exposed as fool's gold, and everyone knew it. The Draco was waiting, its engine already warm from her pre-flight preparations. Ray climbed into the cockpit with the confidence of someone returning home after a long exile. Her hands found the controls by instinct, her mind already calculating the precise timing required for the impossible rescue. Behind her, the command. Tent buzzed with nervous energy, but Ray had moved beyond their concerns, beyond their politics, beyond their limitations. She had a mission to fly and lives to save. Everything else was just noise. Ray's pre-flight checks were poetry in motion. Each switch, each gauge, each system verified with the precision of someone who had run this sequence in her dreams for months. The Draco's engine temperature climbed to 100 degrees and held steady. Outside, ash began to fall again, soft and uneven, but Ray had been expecting it. Her hand-drawn meteorological data had predicted this exact window. The radio crackled to life as she sealed the overhead latch. "Dragon 1, you are cleared for immediate departure. Good luck." Ray keyed the mic once, no words needed. She eased the throttle forward, feeling the aircraft respond like a living thing awakening from hibernation. The wheels rolled, the wings found their bite in the thick air, and the Draco moved toward the ash wall with purpose. Inside the command tent, Julian stood frozen as the operations board displayed Ray's departure. The aircraft's transponder showed a steady climb into the ash cloud, its signal growing stronger rather than weaker. Someone had pulled up the cockpit feed, grainy footage of Ray's hands moving across the controls with mechanical precision. "How is she navigating?" the operations officer asked. "GPS is dead. Radar's showing nothing but static." "She's flying." "By instinct," Captain Chen replied, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and worry. "Martinez always said instruments lie, but air doesn't." Julian felt the eyes of every officer in the tent on him. This was his failure made manifest. The pilot he'd dismissed as dead weight was now the only thing standing between a trapped team and certain death. Every successful radio check from the Draco was another nail in his professional coffin. "Sir," a young communications tech approached Julian hesitantly. "I've been monitoring the flight path data. Her route calculations, they're perfect. She's hitting every thermal exactly where she predicted." The feed from Ray's cockpit showed the nightmare conditions she was flying through: zero visibility, violent updrafts, ash thick enough to choke an engine, but her hands remained steady on the controls, her breathing calm and measured. She was flying through hell itself with the composure of someone taking a Sunday drive. "Thermal pulse in 3, 2, mark." Ray's voice came through the radio, barely audible over the static. A moment later, the Draco's altitude reading jumped 50 feet in 2 seconds. She'd caught the updraft perfectly, using it to gain the elevation needed for the drop zone approach. Julian watched his career implode in real time. The other officers were already distancing themselves from him, their body language shifting as they recognized which way the wind was blowing. His uncle's influence couldn't save him from this level of professional humiliation. "Dragon 1, we have visual on the flares," Ray reported. "Beginning descent to drop zone. Harness is live." The cockpit feed showed her reaching above her shoulder to flip the hatch release. The cargo loop deployed into the superheated air, streaming behind the aircraft like a lifeline. Through the side panel, red flares glowed through the ash, marking the desperate team below. 80 seconds! Ray's voice was calm, professional. One at a time. What happened next would be talked about in pilot training schools for years. Ray held the Draco in a perfect hover despite winds that should have torn the aircraft apart, compensating for each gust and thermal with minute adjustments that spoke to decades of experience. The rescue line dropped, found its targets, and began hauling people to safety. "First survivor secured," came the radio call. Then, "Second survivor aboard." Each successful extraction was another vindication of Ray's expertise, another indictment of Julian's judgment. The base commander turned to Julian, his expression unreadable. "Remind me again why that pilot was relegated to support duties." Julian had no answer. The evidence of his incompetence was literally flying through the air, saving lives he would have written off as acceptable losses. "Last survivor clear," Ray's voice crackled through the static. "Beginning ascent." The Draco's transponder showed it climbing rapidly, escaping the thermal death trap that had claimed the helicopter hours earlier. Ray had done the impossible, and she'd made it look routine. As the aircraft broke through the ash cloud into clear sky, Julian realized his time at the base was over. Ray's success had exposed him as a fraud, a political appointee masquerading as a leader. The other pilots were already looking at her with the respect they'd never shown him. Captain Chen approached Julian with a folder in his hand. "Sir, I believe this belongs to you." Inside was Ray's efficiency report, 15 pages of documented incompetence, fuel waste, and missed opportunities. "She asked me to give this to you after the mission. Said you might find it educational." Julian stared at the report, recognizing it for what it was. A professional death sentence, compiled with the same methodical precision Ray had used to navigate the canyon. She hadn't just saved those people. She'd destroyed him with surgical precision. The Draco's landing lights appeared on the horizon, growing brighter with each passing second. Ray was coming home, and when she did, everything would be different. The Draco touched down just after dusk, its wings streaked with ash and its engine humming with the satisfaction of a machine that had performed flawlessly under impossible conditions. Ray taxied to the far edge of the apron, where a small crowd had gathered, not the usual collection of maintenance crews and logistics personnel, but officers, pilots, and staff who had come to witness history being made. Julian watched from the command tent as the rescued geologists stepped out of the aircraft, their faces drawn with the hollow expression of people who had stared death in the face and lived to tell about it. They didn't speak immediately. What was there to say about being pulled from certain death by a pilot who wasn't supposed to exist? The base commander was the first to approach Ray as she climbed down from the cockpit. His handshake was firm, his words carrying the weight of official recognition. "Outstanding work, pilot. That was flying of the highest caliber." "Pilot. Not support staff. not maintenance crew. The title Ray had been denied for months was restored with a single word. "Sir," Ray replied, accepting the handshake with quiet dignity. "The Draco performed exactly as expected. She's a good bird when handled properly." The subtle dig wasn't lost on anyone within earshot. For months Julian had characterized the Draco as obsolete, unreliable, unsuitable for serious missions. Ray had just proven him spectacularly wrong in front of the entire base command structure. Captain Chen appeared at Ray's shoulder, carrying a tablet loaded with data. "Martinez, the flight recorder captured everything. Your thermal navigation was textbook perfect. Better than textbook, actually. Command's going to want to debrief. This mission for training purposes." Julian felt the walls closing in. A formal debriefing would expose every flaw in his leadership, every instance where his ego had overruled expertise. The comparison between his theoretical knowledge and Ray's practical mastery would be devastating. "I want a full analysis of today's operations," the base commander announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the flight line. "Everything. Route planning, resource allocation, personnel decisions. I want to understand how we ended up in a situation where our most experienced canyon pilot was relegated to support duties while less qualified personnel held active status." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Julian opened his mouth to respond, but found himself speechless. How could he explain that Ray's expertise had threatened his authority, that her competence had made his inadequacies obvious, too? "Anyone paying attention?" "Sir," Ray interjected smoothly, "perhaps we should focus on improving our emergency response protocols. Today's outcome was successful, but we can do better." Even in victory, she was offering Julian a face-saving exit. The gesture was professional, classy, and devastating in its magnanimity. Everyone present understood that Ray could have buried Julian completely, but had chosen to take the high road. The base commander nodded approvingly. "Agreed. But part of improving our protocols means ensuring our most capable personnel are in positions where they can contribute effectively." His eyes found Julian's. "We'll be discussing some personnel changes in the coming days." As the crowd began to disperse, Julian found himself alone with Ray beside the Draco. The aircraft sat silent in the moonlight, its battle scars worn like medals of honor. "You destroyed me," Julian said quietly, his voice lacking any trace of his usual confidence. Ray looked at him with something that might have been pity. "No, Julian, you destroyed yourself. I just refuse to let your incompetence kill innocent people." "My uncle? Your uncle isn't here. He didn't fly through an ash storm to save 5 lives. He didn't spend months studying weather patterns while you played politics." Ray's voice remained calm, professional. "Connections got you this assignment. But connections can't fly aircraft or save lives. Only competence can do that." Julian stared at the ground, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his exposed failures. "What happens now?" "Now you learn from this. Maybe request a transfer to a position that better matches your actual abilities. Stop trying to be something you're not." Ray's tone wasn't cruel, but it was final. "There's no shame in being a good staff officer, Julian, but there's a lot of shame in pretending to be a pilot when you're not." She walked away, leaving Julian alone with the Draco and the wreckage of his inflated reputation. Tomorrow, the formal reviews would begin. The efficiency report would be submitted through proper channels. His transfer requests for Ray would be revealed and scrutinized. But tonight, Ray Martinez, pilot, not support staff, would sleep the peaceful sleep of someone who had finally been allowed to do what she was born to do. The Dragon had flown, the mission was complete, and justice had been served with the precision of a perfectly executed flight plan. Julian's downfall had begun, the moment he'd underestimated her. Now it was accelerating toward an inevitable conclusion, as predictable as the thermal patterns Ray had mastered while he'd been playing political games. The formal review convened at 0800 the following morning in the base commander's conference room. The long table was surrounded by regional command officers, senior pilots, and administrative staff, a tribunal that would determine the future of everyone involved in the previous day's crisis. Ray sat at one end of the table, still wearing her flight suit from the night before. Across from her, Julian occupied a chair that seemed to shrink him with each passing minute. Between them lay the evidence: flight recorder data, efficiency, reports, personnel files, and a stack of witness statements that painted a devastating picture of leadership failure. Colonel Patricia Hawkins, the regional commander, opened the proceedings with clinical precision. Let's establish the timeline. At 1600 hours yesterday, we had a geological team trapped in the South Canyon with no viable rescue options. At 1617 hours, pilot Martinez launched an unauthorized mission in an aircraft that was officially classified as inactive. At 1723 hours, all 5 team members were successfully extracted. Questions? The silence stretched uncomfortably until Julian found his voice. Sir, I want to emphasize that Martinez acted without direct authorization. She violated chain of command and she saved 5 lives, Colonel Hawkins interrupted. Are you suggesting that was the wrong decision, Major Harrow? Julian's face flushed. No, sir, but proper procedures exist for a reason. We can't have personnel making unilateral decisions during crisis situations. Ray leaned forward slightly. Colonel, may I respond to that? Hawkins nodded. Major Harrow is correct that I acted without specific authorization. However, I was responding to the base commander's request for available aircraft and qualified pilots. The Draco was airworthy and certified for operations. I have the maintenance logs to prove it. I was qualified to fly the mission. My certifications are current and valid. She paused, her voice steady. The only thing preventing me from being assigned to active duty was Major Harrow's assessment that I was better suited for support roles. Captain Chen, who had been called as a witness, raised his hand. Colonel, I have documentation that might be relevant to Major Harrow's assessment criteria. He slid Ray's efficiency report across the table. 15 pages of data showing fuel waste, delayed missions, and suboptimal routing decisions, all traceable to Julian's leadership choices. Colonel Hawkins scanned the document, her expression growing darker with each page. Major Harrow, these numbers show a consistent pattern of operational inefficiency since you assumed command. Care to explain? Julian's composure finally cracked. That report is biased, sir. Martinez has been undermining my authority since day one. She constantly questions my decisions, refuses to accept her support role, and she was right to question you, Hawkins said bluntly. According to this data, her route suggestions could have saved thousands of gallons of fuel and dozens of flight hours. Why weren't her recommendations implemented? The room fell silent. Julian looked around the table, searching for support that wasn't there. The other officers avoided eye contact, unwilling to associate themselves with his failures. She wasn't qualified to make strategic decisions, Julian said weakly. She wasn't qualified? Hawkins's voice carried a dangerous edge. Pilot Martinez, please summarize your experience for the record. Ray's response was measured, professional. 15 years of service, 2 combat deployments, certified for multi-engine operations, Canyon Rescue Specialist, 3,000+ hours of flight time in adverse conditions. I've received commendations for tactical excellence and was selected for advanced navigation training before my reassignment to this base. Hawkins turned back to Julian. And your qualifications, Major? Julian's answer was barely audible. Flight school, 2 years of transport operations, assigned to this command 6 months ago. The contrast was brutal. Julian had less experience than most of the captains in the room, yet he'd been given authority over one of the most experienced pilots in the region. The political nature of his appointment was now obvious to everyone present. Major Harrow, Colonel Hawkins said, her voice carrying the finality of professional judgment, you are hereby relieved of command pending investigation. Captain Chen will assume acting command until a permanent replacement is assigned. Julian's face went white. Sir, my uncle... Your uncle isn't here to clean up your mistakes, Hawkins replied coldly. Your personnel decisions nearly cost 5 lives yesterday. Your ego prevented you from utilizing your most qualified pilot. Your incompetence is documented in painful detail. She gestured toward Ray's report. You're lucky this didn't result in casualties, because if it had, you'd be facing a court-martial instead of just a transfer to a desk job. Ray watched Julian's destruction with no satisfaction, only professional detachment. This wasn't personal revenge. It was institutional correction. the system finally recognizing and addressing a fundamental failure of leadership. Pilot Martinez, Colonel Hawkins continued, you'll be assigned to active duty effective immediately. Your personnel file will be corrected to reflect your proper status and qualifications. Additionally, your thermal navigation techniques will be incorporated into our standard training protocols. Ray stood and saluted. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. You already proved that yesterday, Hawkins replied. Dismissed. As the room emptied, Julian remained seated, staring at the table. His golden boy image had been stripped away, revealing the insecure, unqualified officer underneath. His connections had gotten him the position, but competence, Ray's competence, had exposed him as a fraud. Ray paused at the door, looking back at the broken man who had tried to ground her. For a moment she felt something that might have been pity. Then she remembered the 5 people who would be alive today because she had refused to accept his limitations. She walked out into the morning sun where the Draco waited for its next mission. The dragon had not only flown, it had soared, carrying her back to where she belonged. 3 months later, Ray stood in the same operations tent, but everything had changed. The morning briefing hummed with the efficient energy of competent leadership. Captain Chen ran the meeting with quiet authority, incorporating input from his pilots rather than dismissing it. The flight board showed Ray's name at the top of the active roster, her call sign Dragon 1 displayed in bold letters. Weather. Looks good for the northern extraction, Chen announced, gesturing toward the digital display. Dragon 1, you're primary for the canyon run. Standard thermal navigation protocol. Ray nodded, accepting the assignment with the same professional calm she'd maintained throughout her rehabilitation. The standard thermal navigation protocol was based on her hand-drawn charts, now digitized and incorporated into official doctrine. Her techniques were being taught at pilot training schools across the region. The Draco had been officially redesignated as a specialized rescue aircraft, its obsolete status replaced with mission critical. A maintenance crew kept it in perfect condition, understanding that the aircraft had become legendary among the base personnel, the dragon that had flown through hell to save lives. Julian's replacement had arrived the previous week, a competent major with actual experience who treated Ray with the professional respect she'd always deserved. Julian himself had been transferred to a logistics position in Nevada, the same type of career-ending assignment he'd once tried to inflict on Ray. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who remembered those tense months when politics had trumped competence. After the briefing, Ray walked to the Draco for her pre-flight inspection. The aircraft's battle scars from the rescue mission had been repaired, but she'd requested that a small commemorative plaque be installed on the dashboard. 5 lives. September 15, 2024. A reminder that excellence in service wasn't about recognition or rank, but about being ready when it mattered most. Captain Chen approached as she completed her checklist. Martinez, I've got news. Regional Command wants to interview you for the Advanced Tactical Flight School instructor position. It's a promotion and a chance to train the next generation of canyon pilots. Ray considered the offer. Teaching would be rewarding, but it would also mean leaving active flight status. When do they need an answer? Next month. Think about it. You've proven that expertise matters more than politics. Maybe it's time to share that wisdom more broadly. Later that evening, Ray sat by the generator trailer where she'd spent so many nights studying weather patterns and perfecting her charts. The base felt different now, not just because of the personnel changes, but because the atmosphere itself had shifted. Competence was valued again. Experience mattered. The quiet professionals who had been overlooked during Julian's reign were finally being heard. A young pilot approached her, tablet in hand. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez was fresh from flight school, eager but smart enough to recognize that textbook knowledge only went so far in the real world. Ma'am, I was wondering if you could look at my route planning for tomorrow's supply run, Rodriguez said hesitantly. I've run it through the computer models, but I remember what you said about instruments lying while air doesn't. Ray smiled, remembering when she'd been that young pilot seeking guidance from experienced aviators. Show me what you got. They spent an hour going over Rodriguez's flight plan, Ray pointing out thermal patterns that wouldn't show up on standard weather data, teaching the kind of instinctive flying that couldn't be programmed into computers. It reminded her why Chen's offer was tempting, the chance to shape pilots who would value substance over showmanship. The key, Ray explained, tracing wind patterns on Rodriguez's chart, is to understand that flying is a conversation with the air. You have to listen to what it's telling you, not just what the instruments think it should be saying. Rodriguez nodded, scribbling notes in the margins of her flight plan. Is it true what they say about your rescue mission? That you flew through conditions that would have killed most pilots? Ray was quiet for a moment, remembering that day. The ash, the heat, the weight of 5 lives depending on her skills. I flew through conditions that required everything I'd learned in 15 years of service. The only reason I survived was because I'd spent months preparing for that exact scenario, even when everyone told me it was impossible. And Major Harrow really tried to ground you permanently? Major Harrow made the mistake of thinking that politics could substitute for competence. He learned otherwise. Ray's voice carried no bitterness, only the satisfaction of someone who had been vindicated by results rather than rhetoric. The military is supposed to be a meritocracy, Lieutenant. Sometimes it takes a crisis to remind people of that fact. Rodriguez gathered her charts, energized by the impromptu lesson. Thank you, ma'am. I'll incorporate your suggestions into tomorrow's flight plan. After the young pilot left, Ray remained by the generator, watching the stars emerge through the clearing ash haze. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The words were simple but carried the weight of genuine gratitude. Thank you for saving my life. The team from the canyon will never forget what you did. Dr. Michael Thompson, Geological Survey. She'd received similar messages from the other 4 team members over the past months. None of them knew about the politics that had nearly prevented their rescue. They only knew that when death seemed certain, a pilot had appeared through the ash to carry them to safety. That was enough. That had always been enough. Ray pulled out her phone and typed a message to Captain Chen. I'll take the instructor position. Someone needs to teach the next generation that excellence isn't negotiable. As she walked back toward her quarters, Ray passed the Draco sitting under the hangar lights. The aircraft looked peaceful in the soft glow, its battle scars hidden by careful maintenance. But she knew the Dragon was ready for the next impossible mission, the next moment when expertise would matter more than rank or connections. Her story had become legend on the base, whispered among pilots and ground crews as an example of quiet competence triumphing over loud incompetence. But Ray understood that legends were just stories people told to remind themselves that doing the right thing mattered, even when, especially when, it came at personal cost. She'd been called dead weight, dismissed as support staff, nearly transferred to career oblivion. But when the moment came, when lives hung in the balance, she'd been ready. Ready because she'd never stopped preparing, never stopped believing. In her abilities, never stopped understanding that true strength often lived in silence. The instructor position would be different, teaching instead of flying, shaping minds instead of navigating storms. But the core mission remained unchanged, ensuring that competence triumphed over politics, that expertise was valued over connections, that the next generation of pilots understood the difference between leadership and management. Ray Martinez had flown the Dragon through fire and emerged victorious. Now it was time to teach others how to find their own dragons, their own moments of truth when everything they'd learned would be tested by impossible circumstances. The base slept peacefully around her, protected by pilots who understood that being the best meant being ready for the worst. And somewhere in Nevada, Julian Harrow stared at logistics spreadsheets, finally learning the difference between authority and competence. The Dragon had flown. The mission was complete. And Ray Martinez had proven that sometimes the most powerful kind of strength was the kind that never needed to announce itself. It simply acted when action was required, flew when flying was impossible, and saved lives when saving lives was all that mattered. In the end, that was the only victory that counted. Not the destruction of her enemies, but the preservation of the mission, the protection of the innocent, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that when the moment came, she had been ready. The rest was just paperwork. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Ray's journey reminds us that true strength often comes from quiet preparation and unwavering dedication to excellence. Sometimes the most powerful victories are won not through confrontation, but through competence when it matters most. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that their skills and expertise have value, even when others fail to. Recognize it. What's your take on Ray's story? Have you ever been underestimated in your workplace or field? Let us know in the comments. Your experiences could inspire our next story.